Hey, what's up guys? So in this video, we're going to be going over some long distance test results with the new Escort Redline 360c. Now, this is Escort's new flagship radar detector that on their website, they advertise as having unprecedented detection range. What does that actually translate to in practice? Well, let's find out. Now, in order to find out, I brought out all the top contenders to pit the new Redline 360c against. We've got both the original Escort Redline to help set a baseline, as well as the newer Redline EX. Escort is advertising twice the detection range than the Redline EX, so we'll take a look and see if that's true. We've also got the Escort Max 360c. The Redline 360c, they said there's 3 different benefits. One of the benefits is longer range than the Max 360c. Also better BSM filtering, and it's RDD immune. But we're here to take a look at range. Escort has also said that the new Redline 360c has noticeably better range than both the Uniden R7 and the new Valentine 1 Gen 2, so we'll take a look at that. We've also got the Radenso Pro M to throw into the mix if you're looking for a detector that's stealth and RDD immune, good BSM filtering and MRCD, but well, much smaller than the Redline 360c. And then finally, we've got the custom-installed Max CI 360. They're saying that the Redline 360c shares the same kind of underlying platform, so I'm really curious to see if this is kind of a windshield mount version of their $2,400 custom-installed radar detector. Now, in this video, we're going to go over not just one, but 3 different tests, and they all kind of work together to help add more information and give us a better idea of the big picture. Now, as far as the Red Barn course, this is the one that I've used many times. As you guys know, it's about a half-mile long course. We've got the Red Barn on one side, and then I parked the radar car on the other. The radar gun is pointed downrange at various different angles, which I am going to adjust throughout the test for different guns, which I'll talk about. And then there's also 2 different spots on the map that I want to point out. The first one is around 2,200 feet or so. This is going to be kind of the longer distance alert spot. It's shortly after the Red Barn, and some of the more sensitive detectors will be able to alert here. There's also going to be a second detection zone around 1,500 feet or so, and detectors that miss the farther detection spot usually will alert in this spot as you kind of round the bend and you've got a better, clearer view of the radar car up ahead. Now, for this test, we're also going to be testing in both directions. We're going to be testing driving towards the radar car, and then we're also going to be testing by turning around and driving back to the start of the course, and we're going to be measuring maximum detection distances in both directions. And because we're looking at super sensitive detectors here, I actually wanted to make it pretty challenging for the detectors, and so with the radar gun, I actually kind of hid the radar car behind this big bush so you can't really see the car approaching, and it blocks a lot of the radar gun signal as well. And so the kill zone was actually super short. It was about 160 feet or so, so it's a really close range kill zone. It turns out that the detectors are all really sensitive, so this didn't really help for the detector side. They all gave really great alerts. Now, all the test results are also going to be available on my website, and I'll put a link in the description for that. That's going to be a great place to really spend some time and look over all of the results in detail with all the data and charts and graphs. In this video, I kind of want to just go over some of the main highlights that we learned and saw in testing and actually show you the detectors in practice. So now, starting off with 33.8 detection. This kind of split the different detectors into 2 groups. You had the longest distance detectors, and then you had a second group of detectors that didn't really manage any of the longer distance alerts. Now, to simplify things, here's a quick look at all those same test results, just averaged out to make it a little easier to read. The best performing detector was the Max CI 360, which almost always does phenomenal on 33.8. And then we also had the Valentine 1 Gen 2, the Redline 360c, as well as the Uniden R7. I tested the Redline 360c both scanning all frequencies on Ka band as well as segmented 258. I didn't see any differences here, but I am going to see some differences later, which we'll talk about as well. And then kind of as far as sort of the lower tier detectors, maybe we'll say the less sensitive ones, that pack includes the Escort Redline, the Redline EX, the Max 360c, as well as the Radenso Pro M. So on 33.8, as you can see, the Redline 360c managed to hang with detectors like the R7 and the V1 Gen 2, which is great. However, something that you're not going to see in the test results is actually the way the detector alerts as you drive down range. I want to play you a quick clip of one of the runs here on 33.8 with the Redline 360c. And I want you to pay attention to 2 different things. The first thing is I want you to pay attention to the ramp up. As we drive towards the radar gun, listen to the audio and pay attention to if it actually does a good job of letting you know that you're getting close to the radar gun. The second thing is after we pass the radar car, which is going to be on the left side of the road, watch the arrows on the Redline 360c and notice what happens. Do they transition backwards? How long does it take? Pay attention to the arrows after we pass the radar car. So not good here. As you can see, the ramp up of the detector is pretty awful. It does a bad job of accurately conveying the information you need and progressively getting a stronger signal as you get closer to the radar car. I actually did a whole video talking about ramp up recently. You can click the button on screen to watch that. The Redline 360c looks like it actually has the worst ramp up out of any of these detectors that I've tested. Additionally, once you pass the radar car, the arrows never flipped backwards to let me know that I've passed the radar car. So it doesn't do a good job of audibly letting you know that you're getting closer to the radar car, and it also doesn't do a good job of visually letting you know by flipping the arrows backwards that you've now passed the radar car. So the situational awareness here and the alert presentation is pretty bad in the Redline 360c. Now, we also, after we drove down and passed the course, we would actually turn around and then drive back the other direction, back to the start of the course, towards the red barn. Now, we also tested in this configuration and just kind of paid attention to how long does the detector alert and when does it stop alerting, and to see kind of, how good is the rear detection for these different detectors. It's maybe not the ideal way to test, maybe not the perfect way, considering things like maybe an alert latch or whatever, but nevertheless, we saw some really interesting things. Here's a look at the results here for 33.8 rear detection. The best performing detector was the Valentine 1 Gen 2, which actually dominated on all three of the Ka frequencies that we tested on. I also saw good results with the Max CI 360 and the Uniden R7. The Max 360C performed a little bit worse, and then the Redline 360C was actually worse still. I also noticed that the results are kind of inconsistent here with the Redline. This was a pretty common thread too. You'll notice the results can vary a lot more than maybe some of the other detectors. With Ka wide, it actually had one really long detection. You can see the results were kind of all over the place, which was really weird. Now, on that note, you'll notice the original Escort Redline also had one really long rear detection, which is strange considering it doesn't have a rear antenna. I think that was just maybe a reflection off of some signal ahead of me and bouncing back into the detector, but without arrows, I don't have a way to verify, but I did see that as well. Nevertheless, if we take a look here at maybe the averaged results, you can see that the Redline 360C, the results are actually starting to get more in line with some of the detectors that don't even have a rear antenna in the first place. Now, speaking of rear detection, I also want to show you a set of passes here with a couple different detectors. All of the other detectors did a fantastic job of flipping the arrows after I passed the radar car. Remember how I mentioned the Redline's arrows didn't flip at all when I passed in the normal direction? They did a better job when I actually drove the other direction, and then having like a big radar gun blasting me from behind, which makes it really obvious that the signal's now behind you. In this situation, I want to show you a pass with a couple different detectors, and again, I want you to pay attention to two different things. I want you to pay attention to not only how long are they able to hold on to that signal that's back behind you, but I also want you to pay attention to once you pass the radar car, which is this time going to be on the right side of the road, how quickly do the arrows flip and let you know that you've now passed the source. So as you can see, again, a big difference between detectors. The Redline 360C's arrows were much laggier. All the other detectors actually flipped really quickly after passing the source, but the Redline 360C took a lot longer to flip. Plus, it lost the signal a lot sooner than the other detectors did. So the rear detection range plus the arrow functionality are way worse than everything else. I was actually really surprised by this. Next, let's move on to 34.7. So on 34.7, the results here were a little bit different. If you take a look at the results here, you notice almost every detector actually alerts in the exact same spot. Things here were super terrain limited, and pretty much you would kind of round this one bend in the road and almost every detector would alert here in the same spot. Now that said, there were a couple detectors that did manage a longer distance alert. We had the Redline 360C, which managed to do it 1 out of 3 times for both of the configurations, both segmented 258, as well as scanning all frequencies on Ka band, as well as the Uniden R7, which also managed one longer distance alert. But for the most part, you can see that pretty much every detector alerts in the same spot, and it's just due to the design of the course and the nature of the course. Despite the differences in sensitivity inherent to the detectors, This was just set up to where you kind of round the bend, suddenly the signal gets really strong, and all of the detectors alert in the same spot. Next, moving on to rear detection range. Again, the Valentine 1 Gen 2 had the best detection range behind on 34.7. The MaxCI 360 did great as well as the R7, though it did have one shorter detection range from behind, as you can see. And then again, maybe just to simplify these results a little bit, if we take a look at the average of all the different runs of the detectors, you'll notice that the Max 360C is next, followed by the Redline 360C and all of the detectors that don't have a rear antenna. So Redline 360C from behind is performing more in line with detectors that don't even have a rear antenna in the first place. Next, moving on to 35.5, I kind of wanted to change things up a little bit and hopefully not get things that were as terrain limited again. And so one of the things I did was with 34.7, I had the radar gun kind of pointed off to the left a little bit. For 35.5, I kind of pointed it towards the right a little bit more downrange, just to make the signal a little bit stronger downrange, just to see if maybe that would help create a little bit more separation. And it turns out we did see some differences here on 35.5. The V1 Gen 2 did awesome here on 35.5. That's actually a frequency it's pretty strong on. The Redline 360C did great here as well, though that's only the case here when running the detector in Ka wide. If you scroll down, you actually see it did a lot worse running segmented 258, which is really surprising. If anything, I figured having the detector segmented should improve performance, and I was actually told by Escort that segmentation does help on the Redline 360C, but I wasn't able to see that in the test results. May have been totally coincidental, I don't know, but these are the results. Speaking of which, if you take a look at the results here for the Uniden R7, you'll notice that one of the runs was actually shorter than all of the others. For the first two runs, when I was driving down the course, I was able to manage a longer distance detection. However, for the third run, it wasn't able to alert in that spot, and it was because if you drive down a little bit farther, there was this big moving truck driving towards me that was kind of blocking the signal as I was driving down range. And so for that reason, it wasn't able to alert until I got a little bit farther down the course. Now, there is, of course, going to be some variability built into these results here due to uncontrolled variables like traffic. That's one of the reasons why I like to do multiple passes. It's one of the reasons why I'm always saying we need lots of different tests on different courses with different terrains, all that kind of stuff, because there's always going to be some outliers and uncontrolled variables, and that's not just R7. This is going to be for all of the detectors, and it's one of the reasons why we need to take a look at a lot of different test data. And so after we run through this, I'll just quickly take a look at two other tests as well. Now, continuing on down the list, there were a couple other detectors that also managed some longer distance alerts, including the MaxCI 360, the original Escort Redline, as well as the Redline 360c. And then finally, towards the bottom of the list, we had the detectors that never managed any longer distance alerts. And this pack includes the Redline EX, the Max 360C, as well as the Radenso Pro M. Moving on to the rear detection alerts. Yet again, Valentine Gen 2 did the best with rear detection. I also saw some good results here from the MaxCI 360, the R7, and the 360C, especially when run in Ka wide. Again, when it was segmented 258, I saw worse detection range from behind as well. Again, is that a coincidence? Is it actually due to the settings? I don't know. But those are the settings, and these are the test results. And then as we continue down the list, again, we've got detectors like the Max 360C, the Redline EX, the original Redline, as well as the Radenso Pro M. Now, we also planned on testing K-band, but we just ran out of time by the end of the day, doing all these multiple test runs for multiple detectors on 33.8, 34.7, and 35.5. So kind of the overall trends of what we saw here with the Redline 360C is it is capable sometimes of hanging with detectors like the V1 Gen 2 and the R7, but it's not able to do it consistently. We also saw really bad rear detection range. The arrows were really bad. The ramp-ups were awful. Pretty much there were a lot of issues with the detector, which really surprised me. The front detection range was actually better than I was expecting, especially considering some of the tests that I and others had done earlier in the week, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. But before that, for those of you who are still watching this video, a fun story. Guess who stopped by our test again this past weekend? We had the local sheriff stop by our test. Again, we had the police visit us during radar detector testing. Now, luckily, nobody called us in this time for driving back and forth down this road for hours all day long. It turns out somebody had actually called in. There was a bird down they thought was either a bald eagle or a hawk. And so he was actually asking if we were the ones who had called that in. Now, I guess one of the funny things about that was when the sheriff came up to our car, our dash looked like this. Just completely covered in radar detectors. And the Redline 360C actually went off and started alerting when he was right next to us at the door. So that was a thing, but luckily everything was okay and it was no big deal. Okay, so moving on, two more quick tests that I want to talk about. Now, earlier in the week, while I was waiting on the original Redline and the Redline EX to be sent to me for testing purposes, and a big thank you, by the way, to Smoke and U454 and Best Radar Detectors for sending me over your detectors to test with, I was really eager to do some testing, and so I just set up a basic test in my neighborhood. I literally just took a radar gun, pointed it down the road in my own driveway, and then just drove down the street and started driving toward the gun to see what I could find. Now, I first did this test with 34/7. And what I would see is, as I'm kind of driving into an S-curve in the road, the V1 Gen 2 would alert first, then the R7 would alert next while I was in the S-curve, and then only once I exited the S-curve and got down the straightaway, at that point the Redline 360c would alert, and then a little bit farther down the road, the Max 360c would alert. And so based on that test that I'd done earlier, it looked like the Redline 360c was indeed more sensitive than the Max 360c, but it was losing to the V1 Gen 2 and the R7. Then continuing on 33.8, I actually got the worst performance from the Redline 360c. Now, this was only with one run for each detector. I actually stopped after that because the Max CI 360 again dominated on 33.8 and it alerted way farther back, and I didn't actually want to drive that far down the course and just keep doing runs back and forth with everybody walking by. And so I actually just stopped testing there. So I didn't actually test with multiple passes for each detector. But that's just another data point to consider. Now, something else about this specific test, there was an issue with Escort and their Wi-Fi updating process. The detector actually shipped with firmware 1.2. At one point when I was running the detector, I saw there was a Wi-Fi update available in the detector, and so I updated my 360C, but it actually updated the Redline 360C to firmware 1.1. An older firmware. It actually downgraded itself, and this was the firmware version that I was running here, testing here in my neighborhood. And so I was actually wondering after this, okay, was it maybe I was testing with an older firmware, and maybe the newer firmware that I used at the Red Barn, 1.2, they fixed the server issue, and then the detectors re-updated itself back to the firmware it shipped with. It performed better in my particular test at the Red Barn course. Now, the third test that I want to mention is one that Bag and Drag on RDF did. He did a test on 34/7, and on his test, he did a bunch of runs back and forth. He found that the V1 Gen 2 beat out the Redline 360 up ahead, and it also managed to outrange the Redline 360C with rear detections as well. And again, this was with firmware 1.2, which was, I guess, the shipping firmware, or the newer firmware, if we can call it that, at this time. So yeah, I'm not at this point seeing the Redline 360C noticeably, as Escort said, beating the R7 and the V1 Gen 2. In some situations, yes, it can keep up, but I'm not seeing it somehow dominate the competition in any way. Additionally, I'm seeing a lot of issues with the detector. Things like the poor ramp up, the poor arrow functionality, the poor rear detection, all this kind of stuff. It's just not living up to the expectations of what I would expect. And I mean, I'm kind of surprised. Like, that's not Escort's first detector with arrows. They've done a bunch of detectors at this point, both windshield mounts and custom installs that already have arrows built in. They have other detectors that actually have a good ramp up. So it's surprising to actually see a lot of these issues here in the Redline 360C. Now, that said, a lot of the stuff, it's actually a known issue with the Redline 360C, and Escort says they're actually working on a firmware update that should be coming soon that should address a lot of these issues. Things like the arrow functionality, it should improve the sensitivity, things like that. There's a couple updates that are coming. Now, with Escort updates, we'll definitely have to wait and see how and when they come out and if they actually solve the problem. I genuinely have my fingers crossed, and I hope they do, because this is a detector that has a lot of potential. It just needs to get the basics right. The ramp up, the arrows, all the consistency, all this kind of stuff just has to be done right. In the next video, I actually want to give kind of my overall initial impressions of the detector that I've been running it since last week or so. In this video, I just kind of wanted to talk about the long distance test results that I and others have been doing over the past couple days. So anyway, with that said, that's just a look here at the Redline 360C. Promising, yes, but not working well across the board yet. Again, I'm hopeful that Escort is able to eventually get it right, but they're not at that position yet. So anyway, that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.